internet a couple of minutes ago. So we are going to start. Now. Okay, can you hear me, Shalima, and see me?
Yes, you're clear.
Right. So we are going to formally begin now. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. This is the 116th edition of our Zoom public meeting. That's 116. We wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora project. Our chairperson today/tonight is new. She's Shakira Mohammed, a teacher for the past 14 years. She has a BA in Business Management and a BA degree with a focus on special needs education. Shakira is now entering the field of holistic wellness therapies, such as Shen and holographic release therapies. Shakira, welcome. Please take over from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahadew, for that warm welcome. It's always my pleasure. Good night, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Namaste and assalamu alaikum to all of you, depending on the time zone in which you live, because there are always people in this meeting from all over the world. This is the 116th edition of our Zoom public meeting. For 115 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 2 years, 4 months, and 2 weeks, we have featured over 380 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 115 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. Unlike today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions, as well as a donation. Please contact Dr. Mahadew for details. Our moderator this evening or tonight is Shalima Mohammed, the co-director of this Zoom platform. Shalima is a business teacher and a researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. She's a strong advocate for health and wellness practices based on traditional and alternative healing. Shalima, welcome, and please take over from here.
Thank you so much, Shakira. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for choosing to spend this part of your Sunday or Monday with us. This public meeting will now take the form of a panel discussion. To avoid trolls invading our program, our IT manager, Rabin, has muted everyone and has given permission to the presenters only to share their screens. Presenters are advised not to admit anyone or unmute anyone or allow anyone to share their screens. This meeting will not exceed 2 hours, and our topic today is Indo Prime Ministers and Presidents in Fiji, Suriname, Guyana, and Trinidad. On Friday last, Trinidad and Tobago opened the CARICOM Agri-Investment Forum and Expo at the Queen's Park Savannah in Port of Spain under the theme, Transforming Agriculture Through Innovation and Investment. Several regional heads of government were present, including the President of Suriname, Chandrika Prasad Santokhi, and the President of Guyana, Dr. Muhammad Irfan Ali. Like their forebears, over 1.5 million Indians were transported as indentured laborers to work on colonial plantations throughout the world during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their descendants have since played significant roles in the political development of several of these nations in their struggle for independence and beyond, and many of them have gone on to hold the highest offices of the land. Today we highlight 4 of those countries: Fiji, Suriname, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear from our panel of distinguished speakers. And we begin with SAILESH Narayan of Fiji. He's the course coordinator of the Language, Literature, and Communication Department at the University of Fiji. His interests lie in Indian diaspora Girmityas and Hindi promotion. Mr. Narayan, go ahead, please. You have 15 minutes. You can go ahead and share your presentation.
The chairperson, moderator of the session, esteemed academics, members of Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, fellow presenters, invited guests, and dear listeners. Greetings from the friendly islands of Fiji. I am honored to be given this opportunity to present on a review, evaluation of Indian Prime Minister and our presidents in Fiji. Thank you for this opportunity. I shall be speaking on the Indian Prime Minister in Fiji. And the only Prime Minister that came out of Fiji from the point of view of an Indian descent is Mr. Mahendra Pal Chowdhury. This is an image of our Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister, Mr. Mahendra Pal Chowdhury, who was in the office from May 1999 to May year 2000. Moving on to my next point, I will discuss a little about his biography. His name, as you all have just heard, is Mahendra Pal Chowdhury, born on the 9th of February 1942 in Ba. Ba is located in the western region of Fiji, and it is a beautiful place, fully a farming area. Mr. Chowdhury attained his primary education at Tawwa Indian School and then moved on to attain his secondary education at Sri Vivekananda High School. There is an award that was bestowed upon him by the Indian government. This is one of his achievements that I've added to his biography. And this is the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Award, which he achieved in the year 2004. Now, a little information on this particular award. This is conferred by the President of India as a part of the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas. It is organized yearly. It is given to individuals who are overseas Indians. Now, in the context of Mr. Mahendra Pal Chowdhury, he was the son of a descendant. His father actually came from, his grandfather actually came from India as an indentured laborer. And looking at his growing up in Fiji, Mr. Chowdhury's growing up in Fiji, he was into a lot of works, and to recognize his efforts in doing a lot for Fiji, this award was given to him, given to Mr. Chowdhury. So let us look at his roots, Mr. Chowdhury's roots. We are proud of him and his achievements. Mr. Chowdhury has his ancestral ties with the village of Bahadur in Jamalpur in Rohtak district in Indian region, Haryana. This is a map of the district where he belongs to. Many of you may would like to refer to this. So here it is for your assistance. Looking at the next slide, which is a continuation, Chowdhury's grandfather, Mr. Ramnath Chowdhury, came to Fiji as an indentured laborer in the year 1912. This is when the indentureship actually began. So he was part of that, and he came to work in the sugarcane plantations. He worked here, and then he got married, he had children, and then he moved to India. He moved back to India, and then he came back to Fiji again. So basically, we can say that Mahendra Pal Chowdhury is a direct descendant of the Girmityas. The next point that I have on my slide over here is that he made his mark. This is Mr. Mahendra Pal Chowdhury. He made his mark as a man of great insights. and envisioned for a change in many facets of life in the nation of Fiji as well. We will be pondering upon those in the next slide as we continue. During his stay in Fiji as a remarkable person, Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhry was associated with various organizations, and some of them are named on this particular slide that I have shown in front of you. He was the Fijian Secretary General for Fiji Public Service Association, and then he moved on to becoming the Secretary General for the National Farmers Union. And in this, he did a lot of work for the farmers. Now, why he did a lot of work for the farmers? Because he was associated with the Ba community, where mostly they were farmers, and they had a lot of issues regarding their plantations, the crops growing up, and the amount of money they were getting in return. So Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhry played a huge part in improving a lot of sectors in that farming community. He was a member of the House of Representatives from 1987, 1992 until 2006. And he is a leader of the Fiji Labour Party till today. And in the year 1987, he was the Minister of Finance in the interim government. And then also he was appointed again as an interim Minister of Finance in the year 2006 to 2007. It was just a span of 1 year when he was holding that post. And in the year prior to that, he was the leader of opposition. Now, why he was appointed as the leader of opposition, this will sound great because, as I mentioned in my previous slide, because of his insights and his envisionment, he had the zeal to speak for and against certain things which he felt was not proper, which were not legal, and which is not correct. So for those reasons, he was chosen as the leader of opposition in the year 2001, and then he was there till the year 2006. Now, the major thing that occurred in his life, and we all as Indians of the indentureship system, we are the products, and we are proud of Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhry's achievement. He became the Prime Minister of Fiji, the only Indian Prime Minister who served in the government of Fiji, and he sat in that throne from May 1999 to May 2000. Sadly, it was just a one-year term. It all occurred because of certain issues, and I would like to keep them as it is. It may become a controversial issue if I speak in length upon all these. So his term is a Prime Minister of Fiji. The only Indian Prime Minister ever in the history of Fiji was from May 1999 to the year May 2000. Looking at the next slide, let's look at a few of his political career. Mr. Chaudhry helped to launch the Fiji Labour Party, for which he became the leader, and he is the leader now. He was elected to the parliament for the first time in the general elections of 1987. He was appointed as a finance minister in the 2006 interim government. And then he was appointed Minister for Finance in the coalition government of Timothy Bawanra. Timothy Bawanra was associated with him in a Labour Party, and when they won the election, Mr. Chaudhry was appointed as the Minister for Finance. So he had a lot of credentials to his name, and because of his abilities, his skills, his ways of looking at things, and bringing forth important issues to the society, to the people of Fiji, and to the whole world, he was elected into these many positions, basically according to his credentials overall. So we will look at the next slide as to some of the results of his elections. Now, you must be wondering why I'm showing all this is because we are going on to the review. So we are looking at what he has gone through, right? So during his tenure as a candidate for the in the elections, he started off with the North Central National sides in 1985. That was his first appointment as a candidate to fight in the general election, to stand in the general elections actually. And unfortunately, he lost by 6 votes in the election because he was a new individual making a name in politics. It was just unfortunate that he lost. However, when we look at the other dates and the other years and the constituencies that he represented, we can notice that he has won all those seats. Now, why he has won all those seats, ladies and gentlemen and friends, it is only because of his clinical abilities, his ways, his visions, his views, and people admired him. Right? And people admired him, and that is why they were giving him those votes, which made him win those seats in those certain years. So from 1985 to 1986, there is a huge gap in this transition, and we can notice that he has been winning all those except for that only loss in 1985. Moving on to my next slide, let's look at some of his attributes. Right, Chaudhry is known for his combative leadership, which has won him both friends and enemies as well. Now, it is obvious when any particular individual, especially of a different descent, right? For example, over here we can say that he was an Indian descent. Now, he rose up against a lot of things. And in those, whilst standing in those ways, he had made a lot of enemies and friends as well. Now, as I said, it is obvious, but what made him stand the tallest among the others was his willpower, his desire to save the people, to save the country, and to make himself known to the people. Now, the other thing that I have highlighted over here is his ability to gel with the people. He always has a smiling face. There is one factor that we can always notice whilst he is giving his speeches, whether be it in a general public or for his campaigns or in any particular audience. He has a smile on his face and he listens to the people. That is also an important factor within him. And when these factors are in an individual, people will definitely get attracted to them. So the next point, he had a power to voice out his concerns on any issues relating to the betterment of Fiji. And again, whilst voicing out his concerns, he came across a lot of difficulties. He had to suffer a lot, but what finally happened was that he was able to achieve what he voiced out for. So these were some of his attributes, and to sum up this particular slide on his attributes, I would like to share that Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhry, who is on his move to contest in these the upcoming elections, we believe that he will do well. We believe that he will be able to achieve what he is aiming for, and we are wishing him all the best on that. Now, moving on to my next slide on this presentation and evaluation, the first Prime Minister of Fiji, who had an indentureship background, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, that his grandfather came to Fiji as an indentured laborer, and he got married, he had families, and then he went back and he came back. Now, Mahendrapal Chaudhry, who has been in Fiji since his birth, even though he has gone to the various parts of the world on different missions. But when we look at him as an individual staying in Fiji, an individual born and bred in Fiji, he was able to showcase the world. He was able to showcase the world that the generation of the Girmityas, they would be able to work hard. They would be able to show their prowess in every way to achieve great heights. Many at times we feel that because people were sent as indentured laborers to other countries, they had no trades, they were not able to voice out their issues. But here we can see that as the generation moved on, Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhary was able to stand up and show the world that the Girmityas are not less in any ways than the other people of the world. So he brought about changes in policies. Many policies were changed actually. Many remained the way it was. The only reason this happened was because many individuals were not appreciative of his thought of changing the policies. So they remain the same, but those policies that he managed to change are in effect now, and people are getting benefits from that, to which a lot of people are thanking him most of the time. Now, also he voiced out against improper and illegal views. These two particular terms, improper and illegal views, is just an umbrella statement, words rather that I have used over here. I would not like to go deeper into any particular area, as I said, to be within the limit of my presentation. So I do not wish to diverge my thoughts to the inside issues that had been happening. Now, when we look at the work of our Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister, Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhary, he has become a role model for the Indians of Fiji especially, even though the world has recognized him as a Prime Minister of Fiji who had won the elections on his merit. Now, we see him as an individual who has brought about a lot of changes, who has shown the people of Fiji that if there is a will, then there definitely can be a way. In my opinion regarding his evaluation and an overall comment, I would rather say that we are proud Indians who are in Fiji. We feel that we have, even though our ancestors were brought over here, who had faced so many difficulties during their tenure in the plantations, who had suffered in different ways, many ways, which brought them a lot of hardships. Many died and many killed themselves, many ran away, and issues of such came about again and again. But over here, what Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhary, as the only Indian Prime Minister of Fiji, he has shown us that even though our roots were weak at the beginning, but the way he and the other Indians of Fiji have watered those roots and made them stronger, and we can see the fruit that has come about in our sites at this current time. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends and dear listeners, I do wish to conclude my presentation over here with this short presentation speaking on our Fijian Prime Minister, Mr. Mahendrapal Chaudhary, who has become the only, I will say this again, who is the only Indian Prime Minister in the history of Fiji who has brought pride and luck for each and everyone who are Indians in Fiji. With this, thank you so much to you all. You may have any questions and comments, so I would like to open the floor now for your comments and questions, or if you have any discussions that you wish to do. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be over here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Narayan. Those were very interesting insights about Fiji's only Prime Minister of Indian descent. We will hold the question and comments until after all four presenters have gone ahead and presented, okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce now our second speaker, and this is Professor DEWANAND MAHADEW of Suriname. He's the global executive and versatile networker with business experience on 6 continents in more than 80 countries across various industries. Welcome, Professor Mahadew. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Actually, I missed a part of your introduction, but never mind. So I will talk about the same topic, about Indo ministers and presidents. technically from background, I'm a chemical engineer and I've studied business management. So this is not really my field, but it has my interest. I'm also engaged with the Indian diaspora here in Netherlands and in Europe. And also I have some political experience in designing campaigning strategies. So what I will talk to you about today is a bit about Hindustanis in the world, some more emphasis on the Girmityas Hindustanis. It's also the factors that are driving actually the qualities of a president, if you want to call it, or a prime minister, the situation in Suriname, and also I think from my experience, if I look around both here in Holland, in Suriname, but also in the Caribbean, a lot of us thinks that perhaps we are a bit better than the others. It's just as a general feeling. So if we look there are approximately 32 million Hindustanis in diaspora countries. And of them, apparently 1.2 million Hindustanis in the Caribbean. So you can see is the core question comes with these numbers is who are Hindustanis? Because that is something that becomes more and more difficult to define. I'm showing you a few pictures here. I know who is the one on top, on the left top? Who knows that? Who is she? Hello?
Dr. Mahadew, I think you need to advance the slides. We're still looking at the first slide.
Oh, okay. One second.
Right.
Is it better?
Yes, so we're looking at the outline now.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so now you should see pictures.
Yes, we're seeing four pictures, yes.
Yes, that's right. Who can recognize is the top one left is a Hindustani?
I'm sorry, I can't identify.
No, she is a Mexican, for example. And the guy below down, the one is obviously the Indian film actor, Danny Denzompa. And the other one is a guy called Singh, and he is a footballer. And so when it comes to having defined who is a Hindustani, it is becoming pretty difficult for us to define, like, okay, who is a Hindustani? So when you can't define something, it becomes a challenge to work. But anyway, I have tried to analyze a bit, taking a kind of a mainstream. So if we look to some basic statistics of the Hindustani in the Girmityas countries, I'm looking to 5 countries here: Trinidad, where I look to the population, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius, and Fiji. I'm looking at the GDP per capita. I'm looking to the percentage of the population that is Hindustani, the percentage which is African roots, except for Fiji, where we have Melanesian people and others. So there are a few interesting things, is that they are all somewhere between 0.9 and 1.4 million people, because from Guyana, there is approximately 500,000 people living abroad, and from Suriname as well. So they are technically both a bit above 1 million. What we see is that actually they are all relatively small in population. They belong actually to the upper middle class income countries. Trinidad you can consider as high income. And in all these countries, the Hindustanis are approximately 1/3 of the population, except in Mauritius. And in the Caribbean countries, actually 1/3 is a mix or other group. So in general, we cannot say, except for Mauritius, that the Hindustani as a population size are the majority in these countries. So Mauritius is an exception, and all the other, we are actually 1/3 of the population. Then when you come to the question of a president or a prime minister, so I'm looking to actually some factors that actually defines the quality of a president or a prime minister. And this is generally from general literature, that like a president or a prime minister, they should be strategic achievers that are able to persuade others, to negotiate, to maneuver, to make deal making. But they should have vision. They should be trustworthy, be able to lead by example. They should be innovators. They should be able to communicate properly. But they should have also a certain personality or a certain attitude, an attitude that affects, that give them the benefit of doubt, that enable them to be on top of relations and to have a good, proper relation that others will want to work for them, but also have good political sensitivity and have a good political antenna. And finally, there is also governance methods. It's important that any president or prime minister is really a national leader and who is there for everyone in the country, that they should be anti-nepotism, against corruption, be able to handle joint cabinets, because very often you have to deal with multi-party governments, be solid and coherent in decision-making, be decisive, have convincing power, but also diplomatic ability. So I think in conclusion, you should have quite some good skills and competencies to become a quality president or prime minister. It's not something for everyone, obviously. But then I look also to a bit that, because we are talking about Hindustani, do we have some specific basic values that actually drive us who we are? And it doesn't matter whether I'm from Suriname or you are from Trinidad, from Fiji, we share certain feelings, we share certain characteristics, like being sachai, to speak the truth and with compassion, to not go for personal benefit only, to have a non-stealing character, to have compassion, to be able to forgive others. So we have quite some own, let's say, set of skills, of own set of properties that we consider make us Hindustani, the real Hindustani. So it's not mainly how you look like, it's the characteristics do you have. So when I look to actually what are the factors that drives the quality of a president and what does our Hindustani values teach us, and I look to the situation in Suriname, where Chandrika Persat Santokhi is now the president. Then in Suriname, we have the situation that 27% of the population is from Indian roots. We are a young country, independence in 1975, a military regime in 80 to 87. And we had so far 10 presidents since 1975, and of them, 3 were Hindustani, including Santokhi. We had a quite poor performing government in the period 2010-2020, and Santokhi campaigned for 3 years quite intensively. I must say, I personally was also involved in the campaigning strategy of him, and also writing out the economic policy, how to get the country actually uplift the country. And he managed to get 40% of the votes, and which means many non-Hindustanis voted for him. And everyone, both in Suriname, but also in the diaspora countries, were very full of confidence. But unfortunately, to the surprise of many, actually the situation is worse, because there is a lot of stealing going on, a lot of nepotism going on, corruption, many paid jobs for his wife, his children are in crucial positions, and it's financial scandal after financial scandal. The consequence is also a high inflation in the country, loss of purchasing power, and economic decline. So for me, with all the regrets, I have to be honest, I think it's not a good example to have some person like this in such a position. But when I look further about what are the prospects for Hindustani leadership, because one bad example doesn't mean that everyone is bad, is so far we don't have, despite the list of the countries that I shared with you in the beginning, there is nothing such so far like a Hindustani economy. But we have recognizable economic behavior and economic culture in the Hindustani diaspora countries, where Hindustanis are mainly in business and are quite entrepreneurial. We should also not forget that our ancestors used to work mainly in farming, and they had an economical basis, but not really an environment for economic innovation and entrepreneurship. And we know that societies are mainly innovating through middle class and through cities where commercial activities are being undertaken, which leads to specialization in specific skills and competitive advantages. So we have maybe a kind of a backlog we had, because while our ancestors were quite entrepreneurial and hardworking and had the drive to go on and on, they didn't have really the profile for fast development. But I'm glad to see that in all the countries, we are really getting faster and faster. And what I said, since in Suriname and Guyana, half of the population have moved to Netherlands, USA, Canada, or UK mainly, it means that it's more the entrepreneurial and educated people, including the Hindustanis, have moved out of the countries, which means that the profile of what has stayed back is not only in volume less, but is also of weaker profile. When I look then to the Girmityas Hindustanis, where we are now, we are a mix of the second, third, and fourth generations. And as I said, in most of the countries, we have a followers role, maybe a kind of a secondary role, maybe except for Mauritius. I'm not so sure about that. We are quite diverse. We are often divided by religion and religion streams. We are more focused on the ritual sides than on spiritual sides. So we are more busy with repetitive actions than really be creative. Very often we have a distorted self-image. We think that we are successful and caring more than others, but I'm not sure if that's always true. I think we are also on a kind of a crossroad with the identity struggle. Do we belong to our home country, or are we belonging to India, or are we looking to EU and USA? In quite some of the places, pleasure and popularism are above content and in-depth thinking. So we don't have strategic think tank and those type of groups, but we have our lotilal and our pleasure, what we make. We are poorly organized with poor infrastructure, and maybe we don't have the real attitude to support each other. And I think this is where we need to, and I'm very glad that ICC is doing such a wonderful job with this seminars, these events, because this is actually how we should get connected with each other, understand ourselves, know about our strengths and weaknesses. This is a good example for how we can connect with people from all over the world who think and feel a bit like us, but maybe we learn also how to connect with others and get access to alliances and partnerships, and also how we can actually assure that we have representatives with knowledge, content, and convincing power. So here is where we can learn something. I must say that on this point that on the 4th of September, we have a conference here, an Indian Diaspora conference, where we are talking about these topics as well. So challenges for Hindustani leadership are there, because actually we are living in plural societies, as I'm saying, I'm trying to explain here, which divides us. We have actually our ethnical political presentation, so that's good. But we should notice also that in the Caribbean, we have a creolization process ongoing, where actually fundamental change are coming and new cultural forms are being generated or developed. And this actually creolization will result to an erosion of ethnic loyalty. At least that's concluded by Gauri Charan, who is a friend of me. And this means that actually for Hindustani leaders in the future, it will be probably a bit more difficult to get the votes from Hindustani, because this creolization process will reduce the ethnic loyalty. And finally, about the recent protests in Suriname, I saw this board, which was published by a guy in the paper here a few days ago, where actually we see that people are being, Hindustanis are a bit ashamed of what is happening, unfortunately, in Suriname. But this disappointing performance is not good for the future perspectives of Hindustanis in Suriname, because we got the opportunity from the others, we got the floor to perform, and we are not performing. That's what I wanted to share with you in a nutshell.
Dr. Mahadew, thank you very much for those insights. Very interesting perspective there. And I would love to be able to explore further that identity struggle among Hindustanis that you pointed to, perhaps later in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's now hear from our third presenter, and this is Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK of Guyana. He's an adjunct associate professor of political science in New York. He's the author of biographies on Balram Singh Rai and Jung Bahadur Singh. Welcome, Professor RAMHARACK. You have 15 minutes.
Namaskar. So let me just say, at the outset, one of the things that, that we find about ourselves when we talk about Girmityas, I am a third generation Girmitya from Guyana, is we tend to look at our leaders and we don't necessarily, try to be critical about who they are and what they represent. And I think the second problem we have to deal with is the fact that we don't have, the fact that we're all here talking about our own, leaders, is we don't have comparative studies done on our leaders, especially political leaders who have done work in our respective countries. So we don't have that hindsight. So let me just say a couple of things first, and I'll try to shape my conversation in a different way. We've had, I guess, more presidents than any of the other countries. We've got Irfan Ali, Donald Ramatar, Bharat Jagdeo, and of course, Chedi Jagan. So I am going to focus and keep my focus pretty much on Chedi Jagan, primarily because I am assuming the audience is more aware of who he was, so I don't have to go into too much of a bio on him. When it comes to Jagdeo, obviously he's been influential. He's been there from 1999 to 2011 as the president of Guyana. He's done some great things, but I'm not going to talk about him today. Donald Ramatar, who had the shortest period of his presidential tenure from 2011 to 2015. Some people would argue, like, a columnist in Guyana, Freddie Kissoon, that his tenure was probably one of the most disastrous. And of course, Irfan Ali has been there, 2020, we're looking at it not very long. So the hindsight that we should have on them is not there. So I do want to keep my focus on Chedi Jagan because I am doing some research on his background. And I think he, as I said, would be the person, who would be more known to the folks out here. But I also want to keep focused in terms of what I said before, is we don't try to be very critical about who our leaders are. So I am going to try to be critical of Chedi Jagan, who is revered, still revered, many years after his death. He died in 1997, was considered the father of the nation and so on. So very quickly, a little bit of a biographical background of Chedi. His grandparents came to British Guyana in 1901. They came on a ship called Elby. His parents were married at a very young age at that time, about 10, in 1909, right? And they were assigned to a plantation, like all Girmityas were, in Plantation Port Morant. That's where Chedi was born. He grew up in that area. And that's significant because part of what influenced his life came out of that plantation experience. And again, in terms of his bio, he was born in 1918. This would have been, I guess, 1 year after the suspension of indentured immigration, which actually ended not in 1917, but actually in 2020. So he was a dentist, qualified as a dentist. He went to one of the premier schools in Guyana called Queen's College. And then he migrated to the United States. His father was told to send the boy abroad, by another famous Indian in Guyana, whose name was Jung Bahadur Singh. So Chetty studied in the United States as a dentist. He returned to Guyana, and in 1947, he was elected as the youngest Indian into the into the Legislative Council. And he proceeded to, in a sense, quote unquote, destroy the decorum because he took on the fight for the working class population. He was elected. They formed a political party in 1953. He was elected. The Constitution was suspended. He was elected again in 1957, but there were some things that happened. By 1957, his mass-based political organization had split. Now, one of the things that distinguished Guyana from the other three countries here, I guess we can include Guyana with some similarity with Fiji, is the fact that it's a bipolar society, right? Primarily Africans and Indians. So the fight and the struggle for political power is between those two major organizations. So by 1957, this organization was split, the PPP that Chetty formed. So that race issue, some people will argue today it is much more intense, and it probably reflects where we were in the 1960s. But I would say that the regime that Chetty, ran from 1957, I would say all the way into 58, 59, 60 was a very progressive time for especially Indians. Since your audience is primarily Indians, I will speak to that issue. So a lot of Indians progressed. There was a junior, commerce association that was formed. A lot of Indians became very wealthy. They got a break in terms of breaking into the commercial area in Georgetown, which is primarily dominated by the Creoles and the Portuguese and so on. And I think even Chetty Jagan's wife, Janet Jagan, admitted in an interview with David Debedin that those were the most progressive years, when there were agricultural projects that were being built in Berbice and so on. So a lot of things were good at that time. So Chetty, was removed. Well, he was reelected. He is elected to office again in 61. And the country became independent in 66, but lost the election in 64, right? And this is the crucial years that I will try to focus on from 1964 to 1992. Chetty Jagan and his PPP were not in office, right? That's a crucial 28 years. And a number of things that have happened during that time is that we've seen a sort of an Africanization, militarization of a dictatorship that was created by Forrest Burnham. So during that time also, a significant amount of Indians in 1980, the Indian population was about close to 52%. To be more exact, it was 51.9%. Today, that population is about 39%, probably less, and that's according to the 2012 census. So my point is during this time, from a majority Indian population that existed during those crucial 28 years when Chetty Jagan and the PPP were excluded from political power, some people would say he was in the political wilderness, we've seen a migration out of Guyana, where Indians are now a minority. Now, of course, there are some similarities in what happened to places like Fiji, right? Going back to the coup in 1980. So we see that rift, that division. So my point here to this, in terms of the numbers, is that this was the time where Indians were forced to leave, and this was a crucial time where they were not being protected. So let me take a step backward to say some things about Chetty that most people will tell you. He was a very charismatic person. He came at a time, when people were, still tied to the plantation. The sugar industry was controlled by the Europeans. And what Chetty would do, he would fold his sleeves, take his sneakers out, and he would cross the trench into the fields and try to explain the situation and the exploitation that people would feel. So he kind of developed into this charismatic figure, right? People would, in a sense, treat him as God. They would worship him. There's a famous poet, Ved Prakash Vatuk, who reminded us that Chetty developed as a sort of a cultural icon, a political icon, a myth. People would cut the newspaper picture of him and preserve it. I remember in my home, my parents would have a black and white picture of Chetty Jagan right next to a picture of Mahatma Gandhi, and they would put the mala on both of them, and that's a prominent mala. So as soon as you step in our home, that's what you see. So this is a kind of charismatic hold that Chetty had on Indians. And so what that means is nobody could have challenged him seriously, politically, especially during that crucial period from 1964 to 1992. Right? So again, we're looking at migration of people out of Guyana, a reduction of Indians from a majority to a minority, right? Similar process, as I said, in Fiji and so on. So we've got all of that going, right? So that was a Chetty Jagan that people grew up with, right? So when the name Chetty Jagan comes up, people would kind of, be in awe, right? This is charismatic person. But what I do, as I said, at the outset, I want to focus on some of the other side of Chetty, because I do believe that we can't just sit back when all of these things that are happening that affects our lives and assume that everything that these folks did, were in a sense positive. So there are some negative things which we can kind of look at as critical about Chetty. So one of the things I do know, and I can tell you for a fact, that there is really no study, absolutely no study on Chetty Jagan and his relationship with Indians, right? Most of the studies that were done, in a sense, focus on Chetty as a nationalist leader, right? But that gap still exists. So the question is, how do we assess this person? Well, there are a couple of things I'm just going to throw out. I don't think it's going to earn me any friends within the PPP, but just a couple of things which we can talk about later in the interest of time. Chetty was, if you accept the word of a person by the name of De Carey's, who established the most widely read newspaper in Guyana, Stabroek News, he said Chetty was deeply flawed. Right. I do believe he was very naive. I think the literature has shown that. Clem Sicharan has written a book assessing Chetty Jagan's, tenure, as an opposition leader and as a leader of Guyana. And if you go back to the Cold War years, his interaction with the United States. Remember, in the 60s, the United States was concerned about a second Cuba, after Fidel Castro. Chetty was very brash. He was very bold, right? So he adopted this Marxist creed. And I do have to say that there is some critique about his earlier life that may have caused him to become so enamored with socialism, knowing fully well, and people have told him this, that most Indians who supported him, keep in mind, most Africans did not support Chetty Jagan. But again, for that crucial 1964 to 1997 years, Chetty Jagan held on to that sort of a communist philosophy with dear life, right? Even when he died in 1997, there were interviews done with him, go back to 1991, where he said, this is the way to go. I'm still a communist. He may have recognized the end of the Cold War, but I believe philosophically, that whole notion of being a Marxist was still with him. And if I have time, I'll read a quote from an interview that he did with Professor Birbal Singh. So naivety was something that we've seen in Chetty, right? His whole notion of being a Marxist was detrimental to the Indian cause. In an interview he did with V.S. Naipaul, when Naipaul posed the question to him, how do you describe your philosophy? He did say, I'm a communist, but he also went further and said that his influence, and all of this took place primarily in Guyana, his influence came from Jana Jagan, who was a young Marxist, in Chicago who Chetty had married. He admitted to V.S. Naipaul that it was Janet Jagan who fed me with these little Marxist-Leninist books, the V.I. Lenin books, that Chetty became enamored. And when you look at his philosophy, you look at everything Chetty has written, everything he has written in the Thunder, the party organ, everything in the Mirror, it's always about Marxism. But the most detrimental thing, if you want to be critical about Chetty, is his misunderstanding of geopolitics. I talked about his meeting with Kennedy in the 1960s. In that meeting, Kennedy left convinced that this person is a Marxist, going to be a problem. But the most detrimental part about his philosophy was not necessarily so much his Marxism, because the British were still willing to forgive him for that. But it was his pro-Soviet alliance that really created a scenario for Chetty that kind of boxed him into a philosophy that I'm a Marxist, but I'm also pro-Russia. And I think that is what was used during the time he was out of office for the United States to say, look, this guy is going to be a problem for us. So in the meantime, what happened is that Indians are fleeing the country, right? They're leaving, they're going to different shores. And today you have more Guyanese living outside of Guyana than in Guyana. So now there were attempts by a lot of people who try to meet with him to kind of address this whole philosophical question about his ideology. And I'll share one with you. One of those person is a person by the name of Hari Prasad. An interesting story about Hari Prasad is this guy, he was an entrepreneur. He rose, from cutting logs, and then he got into the business of real estate. 1952, he took his 7 kids and his wife, went to India, but then came back in 1953. And he built a sort of a village called Prasad Nagar. Anybody from Guyana would have been familiar with that name, Prasad Nagar. Now, Hari Prasad was concerned in his meetings with Chetty. By the way, he did work, with Chetty before he was actually helping them with the newspaper and so on. I think it was called a New Guyana Company. So him and other businessmen met with Chetty and they said, look, but this might be a problem, especially this whole notion of being pro-Russia, pro-Soviet, and your communist philosophy. The response was, well, if you don't like it, then you guys can leave and form your own party or do whatever you want to. So that's one example of a situation where, Indians were concerned about this whole philosophical approach, right? And we know what happened since then. So the other thing I do want to touch. Yes.
Excuse me. Please make your closing comments.
All right. So the other couple of things, well, let me just jump to the legacy of where we are, because the legacy of Chetty has to be seen in hindsight from what he has done, and obviously through the organization that he has created. One of the things we see today in Guyana is that there is a tendency for the political organization he left behind not to, in a sense, address this, what we call ethnic security dilemma, this great schism or shift we see, a split we see in Guyana, because the tendency is to say, well, or to make the argument that since we're not dealing or addressing race issue, that problem will be, it's a false consciousness, is going to be addressed as the economy develops. Now, yesterday, there was a meeting that was planned by members of the opposition that have actually labeled this government an apartheid regime. And that's how extreme things are. But my point is, there's really no serious attempt to try to kind of find solutions and try to deal with that ethnic problem. And I think the other thing I want to leave you with is the whole notion of institutional power. Given the experience that the PPP has during those years that they were excluded from power, there's really no serious attempt to change the institutions of power. So my question that I would pose, for instance, is, and I'm going to wrap this up in a minute, is if the PPP were to lose power today, would Indians be in a secure position? And the answer that I can come up with on my is no. Janet Jagan, when she resigned in tears in the 1960s, you know, when an entire village of Indians were rooted out in a place called Wisma, she said that the armed forces were not responding to her. We have seen nothing change in those institutions of power to date. The PPP has been in power for so many years before, 2015. And of course, we've seen no movement in that direction as yet. So you've got that sort of a anti, sort of attitude about addressing anything that's Indian oriented. We still do not have, for instance, a movement to document the indenture labor route program. Those documents are sitting, even though, there have been many meetings with PPP officials to try to make sure those things are documented. And I can go on and give you some other examples, but I'm going to leave it at that since you're saying my time is up.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for that very unique analysis of Guyana's nationalist leader, Chedi Jagan. I'm sure we'll have a number of questions waiting for you. Excuse me. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Professor RAMHARACK, and let's move on now to our fourth and final speaker. And this is Dr. KIRK MEIGHOO of Trinidad and Tobago. He's a former university lecturer, political scientist, and former temporary independent senator. He's now the Public Relations Officer of the Opposition United National Congress, the UNC. Welcome, Dr. MEIGHOO. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. Welcome to my colleagues, fellow panelists. And so it's my pleasure to be here. I want to start off by saying I am the Public Relations Officer of the United National Congress. And I do want to make it clear that the United National Congress is a national party representing all of Trinidad and Tobago. But our party has presented the only two prime ministers of Indian descent. And the bulk of our support does come from the Indian community, and that is true. And we will speak about the complications of that, because there's not such thing as a single Indian community. And that's something very interesting to look at. And then also, we represent across all ethnicities and classes and so forth. Because I do want to put this as part of the background. It's very important that although people say that Trinidad and Tobago has racial politics, it's really only one party that practices racial politics, and that is the PNM. They constantly bring it up, and they rely on it, similarly to the way the PNC agitate in Guyana in terms of bringing up these racially antagonistic narratives all the time. But the PNM has inherited the old colonial prejudices and the hierarchies and the hegemony, particularly the anti-Indian and anti-Hindu prejudices, so forth. So that has prevented a proper appreciation of the composition of Trinidad and Tobago. And the UNC has always stood for the inclusion of everybody, and that necessarily means the inclusion of Indians as well. And what the PNM have done actually is just have an Afro-Saxon elite replace the British, replacing the British colonials. But we have presenters from other places, and I will do a comparative analysis as part of my my presentation, because it's something I've thought about for decades and decades. It's very interesting to compare Trinidad, Guyana, Fiji, Mauritius. Very interesting similarities and differences. But now, in Trinidad and Tobago, many of us here of an older generation who are, adults in the 1990s, would remember we grew up with the idea that and it was openly expressed, that there would never be an Indian prime minister in Trinidad and Tobago. This was commonly accepted, and I think even many in the opposition believed it as well at the time. But that, I think a lot of people, I think in the country, well, we've broken that barrier, and so that idea doesn't exist anymore. But that was a huge, huge hurdle and ceiling that was broken. And I want to just sort of document the journey and tell the story of how we overcame that struggle to have Indians included in the political power structure. And that's part of creating an equitable and just Trinidad and Tobago. I want to state as well that we've had 7 prime ministers so far in Trinidad and Tobago. Independence is coming up very soon. And 2 of our 7 prime ministers are of Indian descent. And we've had 6 presidents in Trinidad and Tobago. The president is a ceremonial position, unlike Guyana. And of those 6 presidents, only 1 has been of Indian descent. So that is instructive there as well. Now, the People's National Movement was in power from 1956, since colonial times, and then through independence in 62. I know Guyana got independence in 66, Mauritius in 68, Fiji in 1970. So of these 4 countries, we got it independent first. The British policy towards that is interesting, and perhaps you could take that into discussion, because they had very different policies towards the Indo populations of these places. The slides, if you can just take it back, and don't reach to Chambers as yet, please. And I will get to what that slide, the significance of that slide is later. But we had a party in power for 30 years. The PNM was in power from 1956 up to 1986. So in a way, it's similar to the PNC in Guyana. 30 years uninterrupted rule by the PNM. And during that 30 years, from 56 to 86, there was not a single Hindu in the cabinet during that time. And what is unusual is that before 1956, Hindus were part of the Albert Gomes government at Singh, and very much part of the Legislative Council and the Executive Council as well before that in the colonial time. So that was a change that the PNM brought in excluding Hindus from the national political process. So that's one thing. Now, if we get to the slide, I'm for some reason, the way I'm viewing this, I'm not seeing the slide properly. So I'm hoping we are seeing the slide with Dr. Eric Williams, Kamaluddin Muhammad, and Errol Mahabir. Now, the PNM portrayed itself as a nationalist party, but it did suppress and marginalize the Indian presence in its conception of what was authentically Trinidadian and Tobagonian, and what was not. Right? So Carnival is authentic Trinidad culture. Diwali is not really. Right? Steel pan is authentic Trinidadian culture, but Tassa not really. So these were the types of definitions of the country that the PNM had imposed on the country when they took us into independence. And with the death of Eric Williams in 1981, so remember, so the PNM was ruling at that time for 25 years, and he had died in 81. Now, the PNM did have Indian deputy leaders. Right? Interestingly, and this is when I was talking about the differentiation among Indians, Errol Mahabir, who was a very prominent person, spoken about the PNM blue-eyed boy and so forth, but he was a Presbyterian. Kamaluddin Muhammad was a prominent Muslim, of course. And so they were the 2 deputy leaders. The 3rd deputy leader was George Chambers. And George Chambers, really, when you look at it, the 3 deputy leaders, was the least known, the least active. He was not anywhere near as prominent as Errol Mahabir and Kamaluddin Muhammad. But the president at the time, who was Ellis Clark, just decided on his own that George Chambers, well, actually, the timing of it may have to do also with the PNM, their whole process, right? But what had happened was that the two Indian members were bypassed. And so that idea that the PNM kept promoting, that they are truly a national party, the facade was exposed by that. Now, in 1986 was the first time, and this is very similar to what happened in Mauritius in 1982, and to a certain extent what happened in Fiji in 1987. There was a coalition of parties in which the party which represented the Hindus was the majority party. However, there was this idea, although they were the party that had the majority of support and the most seats in the parliament, that was the ULF, there was this idea at the time that Trinidad and Tobago was not ready for an Indian prime minister. And so Basdeo Panday was not put at the head. And instead, A.N.R. Robinson was. I can't see the slides now, but I'm hoping that we are at the A.N.R. Robinson slide. And so A.N.R. Robinson.
We can advance to that. We're looking at George Chambers right now, but we can advance to A.N.R. Robinson, yes.
Right. So A.N.R. Robinson became the prime minister. And that multi-ethnic coalition and that multi-party coalition, and also ideologically different as well. It was diverse in so many ways. But what they did do is they appointed a president who's largely ceremonial in the Trinidad and Tobago context for the non-Trinidadian audience here. So it doesn't really have much power. But for the first time, an Indian, and the first and only time, an Indo-Trinidadian was made the president. And he was Noor Hassan Ali, very much loved by the country. And he was a Muslim. And I think this also speaks to sort of the latent anti-Hindu bias, suspicion of Hindus as well, which comes from the colonial Christian heritage of Trinidad and Tobago. And that these are things that still linger, but over time they have been broken. But by this time, in 1987 was the first time we had an Indian president, but not yet prime minister. And Noor Hassan Ali was reinstated by Patrick Manning and the PNM when they came in power in 1991, to their credit. And certainly, as I said, he was widely respected, appreciated, even though there were many in Port of Spain who did not like the fact that there was no alcohol served at President's house during that time, because cocktail parties are a big thing. But that, so he brought his principles with him. So the ceiling, and the most important ceiling for the prime minister to be of Indian descent, was broken in 1995. And that was not done with an outright victory, in fact. It was a 17-17-2 tie. And people weren't sure where those two Tobago votes were going to go. And that was actually A.N.R. Robinson who held those two votes. Would it go to the PNM or would it go to the UNC? Patrick Manning or Basdeo Panday? And they eventually joined with the UNC. And I'd like to hear the views of other Trinidadians who remember that time, but I honestly believe on that very day, not even Basdeo Panday believed that we would have an Indian prime minister when it happened. It was a psychological barrier, like breaking the sound barrier almost, and it makes a boom. That's sort of what happened. It really was a seismic shift that happened. And the Rubicon had been crossed, which is, but I mean that in a good way. That's usually a negative metaphor. But it was a very, very important development. And since then, well, he had lost government by 2001, and our second Indian prime minister was elected into government in 2010, and that's Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bissessar. And not only was she Indo-Trinidadian, she was also the first woman. And again, you know, Bastio Pandey was not only the first Indo-Trinidadian prime minister, he was the first trade unionist as a prime minister as well. That's very important in our context as well. So there were many firsts that the UNC pioneered. One of them being an Indian prime minister, but also a female prime minister, also a trade unionist prime minister. That's just briefly recapping some of this story. I want to make some comparative observations before I close. I know my 15 minutes is just about up, but just comparative with Fiji and Mauritius quickly. There are amazing parallels that around the same time that these developments were happening in Trinidad, similar things were happening in Fiji. And I don't know why that is. It's almost mystical. So in '86, when you had this coalition in Trinidad, you had one in Fiji, and then there was a coup in '87. And then later on, when Bastio Pandey was prime minister from 1995 to 2001, you had Mahendra Chaudhry in 2000, well, 99, and then you had the coup in 2000 against. And you know, the Fiji situation is far, you know, more ethnically driven and vicious than Trinidad and Tobago, sadly. Right, that's my timer. I set my timer. But I want to just talk just briefly about Mauritius too, to compare, because it's very interesting. Mauritius is like the opposite. It's like an inverse of Trinidad and Tobago. Whereas the Creole population in Trinidad, meaning the non-Indian, so both the Afro-European Christian population, whereas the Creole community in Trinidad is a majority, and the Indian a minority. The reverse is true in Mauritius. And just like how we had a party in power for 30 years that was Afro-dominated, they had Sir Siyosagar Ramgoolam. And you could put the slide to him, please. Sir Siyosagar Ramgoolam. And just as Eric Williams was considered father of the nation in Trinidad, Sir Siyosagar Ramgoolam was considered father of the nation of Mauritius. And just like there was a coalition in the 80s that deposed that party, same thing happened in Mauritius in '82. And the same thing happened that the largest party was led by Paul Béranger. You could put that slide as well, who was a kind of Pandey-like figure. He represented the Creoles, the minority, right? And they had the largest group in the coalition, but in Mauritius, the discourse was the country was not ready for a Creole prime minister. They used the term Creole in Mauritius, that the country was not ready for a Creole prime minister, which is the exact same thing, except opposite being said in Trinidad. And then in Trinidad, the NAR, that coalition broke up because Bastio Pandey said that coalition government was disrespecting that large base of the ULF, which is mainly Hindu. Béranger said the same thing with Ramgoolam. And he said how Ramgoolam was disrespecting the large Creole base and making, you know, decisions on behalf of the minority. And then that government broke up as well. And just like how Pandey and Robertson got back in 1995 in government, Béranger and Ramgoolam got back together in the 90s, I believe again, during the same period. It is quite amazing. So what that shows now is a structural thing, and not necessarily about race per se, but about majorities and minorities, or political majorities, political minorities. So these things are interesting to reflect upon. You know, how much of these things are racial, how much of them are structural, and that the positions and roles can be changed. And when we take a look at our countries, comparatively, we find a lot of these very interesting things, not least of which is, why is it that these developments are happening at the same time in Fiji in the Pacific, and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago. It's quite fascinating. But I will leave my presentation there, and in the question and answers, perhaps we can have more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meighooo. That was a very insightful analysis and indeed very timely. I want to thank all of our presenters for their time, sacrifice, your efforts, expertise, and availability. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is being recorded live and would be uploaded later after editing on YouTube permanently for posterity. The meeting is also being live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and I want to welcome all of our viewers to that live stream. The floor is now open for questions, comments, and contributions. Let us please keep them brief so that the presenters will have an opportunity to answer as many of your questions as is possible. I'll ask you now to please, if you do have a question, kindly raise your electronic hand in the reactions button at the base of your computer screen. Only then would our IT manager, Robin, allow you to speak. I know that we've had an outstanding question from a few people, and I will ask first Dr. Derek Davey from Canada. Dr. Davey, you had a question early on. Go ahead, please. You can unmute. Robin, would you be able to unmute Dr. Davey, please?
My fault, sorry. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to join. And this is an excellent forum that we can learn and enjoy our existence of more than 32 million non-South Asian living abroad. Well, Asian living abroad and aspire and successful. Anyway, one quick question to Dr. BAYTORAM RAMHARACK that sort of related to Dr. DEWANAND Mahadew, sorry. I'm originally from Guyana. I'm a small politician in Canada and also an education official. But I really like the presentation that talks about our heritage and our achievements as leaders across the world. However, I was hoping Dr. BAYTORAM would have emphasized the real legacy of Jeddi Jagan. I notice I read in Guyana papers about your passion and your writing about Jagan, but you've been dwelling for the last 20 years or on the past flaw. Yes, he's a flawed leader. Yes, he is naive. Yes, Dr. Jagan was brash and a socialist, but he helped to bring out the West Indians out of colonialism. And let's make this note. It was in his notation, Guyana had the first labor union in all of the Commonwealth, British colonies. And that's what I want to dwell on if we can continue with him in future. But now I will ask Dr. BAYTORAM, with your energy and passion, please continue to speak up for what you speak of, equity, anti-racism, and together building Guyana together and other countries. But the president and the prime minister now in Guyana can use your advice. Let's not dwell in the past of Jeddi Jagan. His legacy is remarkable, but his flawed also is noted. But let's look at solutions. As Dr. DEWANAND Mahadew says in Suriname, he had a lovely list of integrity, anti-corruption, charisma, and leadership. Those are the things we can help our leadership with. And I, once again, thanks everybody. And thank you for continuing this great job. Thank you.
Well, okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
All right, so a couple of things, right? Well, you know, we do have hindsight, as I said, right? And I started out my discussion by saying that I do want to look at a critical assessment of Jeddi, because I don't think that's being done enough. And what we do have is we have a society, Guyana, you know, which is really existing upon some of his legacy. So therefore, what we have to do, and we can't fail to do this, is to look at the way the society is governed and how, you know, what Jeddi has left behind has influenced and impacted the way we do things. And I can tell you this, one of the things and one of the challenges we have, and I've interviewed a lot of people in the last few months who share exactly the same sentiments, that we have to look at the positive things about what he did. We know he had flaws, but the problem is it's not a chapter we can just close and put it behind us, because as I said, leaders today are governing in the same tradition to a certain extent. Obviously, the crop of people who are governing Guyana today are no longer enamored by the philosophy that Chetty shared, right? And I did point it out that he had some positive things, but there's some flaws. And I pointed out the effect of those flaws. And one of them that I would share with you is this whole idea of trying to figure out how to address this ethnic problem. He has left a legacy for the younger generation who are now governing Guyana, for instance, that you can't, the ethnic problem will disappear on its own. I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with him in his office in Guyana, and I wanted to discuss, the legacy of what he, what Guyana is, the ethnic problem. And once I approached that issue, he says, well, you're talking race, and we can't do that. So he went off in a whole, 15, 20 minutes lecture about class struggle. So my point is, Chetty has also done some damage where, and this is another example where he has destroyed or helped to destroy every Indian political leader who, in a sense, and again, I'm speaking to a largely Indian audience, right? So I don't want to be opportunistic and say, okay, let me talk to this audience. And this is what Chetty represents for a lot of us. He has destroyed a lot of Indian organizations, Indian political leaders who actually stood up, like Balram Singh who would be one of them, right? Indian organization like the British Guyana East Indian Association has also, received some criticism from him, and that organization died. But I want to bring this to the current situation that we're dealing with. We have a situation today, and again, this is part of the legacy of Chetty that we have to recognize. We're discussing ethnic issues, discussing racial problem, and how to find solution is something that they don't want to deal with. Right. And I give some examples about, what we have in the archives and so on. So we today don't have a single organization, a single Indian organization that speaks out on behalf of Indians, because if that should happen, the PPP will cripple those Indian organizations. I'll give you another example. We've talked about some things that everybody should be concerned. The current curriculum in Guyana, they have a series of 6 books that were written, has ignored the Indian experience and the Native Amerindians. No response from the government. We've talked about the whole issue of Indian Arrival Day. Again, this is a legacy of Chetty. Anything discussing Indian was anathema. This government continues that legacy because they are afraid to use the word Indian in Indian Arrival Day. So if you're telling me that the flaws were insignificant, my challenge to you is that the flaws that Chetty had and the legacy that he left behind is responsible for me and for a lot of Indians who are living outside of Guyana. Right? That country has been broken, and Indians have a tendency to blame the 28 years on the PNC. But remember, these are people, who represented Chetty, who were walking around with T-shirts that says "Power to the People," and on the back of it that has a machine gun. But they allowed this regime to exist for 28 years. And here's a person who died and was rescued. In 1992, he died in the United States, right? And his party was rescued again in 2020. But he spent his entire life cussing the United States. So my point is, we can't just simply brush it off by saying he had some flaws. The flaws were very detrimental to who we are today. And we have to recognize that. And I think that has to be discussed when we talk about his legacy, because it is part of it. Right? I'll give you one last example and I'll stop.
Mr. Dr. BAYTORAM, yes, thank you. We have people waiting, but you've been this for 20 years. Let's move on. But please implore the present government to do exactly what you're saying. Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen. Thank you very much for that contribution. Dr. Devanand Bhagwan, go ahead, please.
Namaskar, bhaiyo aur behno. Assalamu alaikum. Just want to let you know that I'm Guyanese, and I'm a born-again evangelical Christian. And I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Dewanand Mahadew for emphasizing the whole idea of Hindustanism. I think this is very significant. Yeah, and I would encourage us Caribbeans, Indo-Caribbeans, to espouse that particular term, Hindustani, as opposed to Girmityas. Okay, Hindustani, this is a very powerful, significant term. Girmityas, it's very difficult. People have a hard time relating to that. Anyway, I'd like to dwell very briefly on what Dr. RAMHARACK and Dr. MEIGHOO have touched on. And I think it's related to this whole idea of Hindustanism. Dr. MEIGHOO mentioned at least 3 times, possibly 4, about his disappointment of not having a Hindu leader there. Instead, you've got Christians. These are Indians, when you're talking about in this context, a Muslim and a Christian Hindu person in position. I think it is very important to look at the full scale, look at the broader context. Yes, Dr. RAMHARACK, I really appreciate it, what you're saying, that the heart issues of many Indians in Guyana perhaps were not dealt with by Dr. Jagan, but I do agree with Derek there that Dr. Jagan has done a tremendous amount of work on behalf. He's highlighted the problems of Indians, but not just Indians. He did not just look at ethnic cleavages. Instead, he looked at you have to realize that Guyana, like Trinidad, is a multicultural and it's a multi-ethnic state. And therefore, Jagan, he did not merely cater to mainly to his supporters. He recognized the importance of taking into consideration the entire gamut of peoples in the country. And no, I'm not an expert on Trinidad politics, but I have a feeling that's where Kamala Prasad Bisesar failed and the UNC because they were too narrow-minded, looking mainly for Indian support. I think it's important for us to just tear off some of these barriers and recognize the universalhood of peoples, and especially within our Indian people, to recognize, like, we can appreciate our differences, yet at the same time, recognize that hum log Hindustani hai, theek hai? We are Indians.
Okay, Dr. Bhagwan, let's get a response from Dr. MEIGHOO.
Yeah, that's totally wrong, and I want to absolutely refute that statement that the UNC catered only for Indians. That is the absolute, I mean, no factual analysis. I mean, you admitted you don't know about Trinidad politics, and I can't allow, this is an international audience, and I can't allow a smear like that to happen. The UNC has always been this record show how we have developed the entire country. And unfortunately, that's part of the narrative that has been used against the UNC, because the UNC has equitably distributed resources. Then people have said it's discrimination because other people who perhaps, and other groups who may have gotten a larger share, have found that they have had to share with other groups that were excluded in the past. So I have to absolutely disagree with that view. You admitted it was uninformed, and we cannot allow that slander to spread, because it keeps the repressive, divisive PNM in power. It wrongly paints what the UNC stands for and what it always stood for. So there's that, and I wasn't expressing necessarily my disappointment was not based on any ethnic chauvinism. The disappointment about the exclusion of Hindus is that the Hindus are the second largest religious group in the country. It's not some small group, and that the exclusion of that group, which once were part of the national politics, that is extremely significant. Imagine you're swearing in members of cabinet and you don't have a Bhagavad Gita anywhere, even though it's the second largest religion in the country. That's a massive discrimination. And that's not something that one should just brush off. That is massive, massive alienation. These were the terms that were used by the party: alienation and discrimination. And we unapologetically stand for the inclusion of everyone, And that includes Hindus.
Let me just quickly, briefly, I mean, it's one of the things that when we look at Indian leaders, and I think KIRK clarify that about, what's going on in Trinidad. But when we look at Indian leaders, we tend to say, well, okay, what is the universal values that they represent? We all know, and the record is there, that Cheddi Jagan was much more concerned about, fighting capitalism, right? Promoting communism. That's his philosophy. But my general point here, and I think this is what is missed, we tend to look at that picture, but we ignore the cost at which that came. Cheddi Jagan, in his, the opening line in his book, he says, I know very little about my ancestors in India. In 1953, Dick Hart, who was a communist he recruited from Jamaica, who was in charge of the Mirror, the party newspaper, said, and again, everything I'm telling you is coming from Cheddi Jagan's words and people who knew him, said that Cheddi was afraid to go to Indian weddings and Indian functions because he was afraid that he would be branded as an Indian and as a racist. So my point to you, Dave, is that, yes, he was there, he represented universal values, he was championing this new economic order, and so that's all well and good. But there was a cost to that, and during that 28 years, and this is the key point that I'm making, is that he forgot that there were people who supported him loyally, right? And those people felt the brunt of the mistakes and the naivety of what happened during Cheddi Jagan's rule. And I'm not saying that we need to deny, right? But I would love to hear an Indian like Walter Rodney, who was assassinated in Guyana, who would say, I am an African, I am from the Caribbean, I am a Guyanese, and I believe in African culture, and I know Africa. You would never hear an Indian in Cheddi Jagan's time and an Indian in this government today make those statements, because they're pushing this whole idea of one Guyana, which is nice. I am Guyanese. So what does Guyanese mean? Guyanese means you have people of different ethnic group. The prime minister, who's a black person, went to Buxton during the recent riots when Indians were beaten up. And he said, I am Afrocentric, I am an African. And I will always represent you, something to those effect. When was the last time you, Dave, had actually heard someone of an Indian, specifically from the PPP, utter those kinds of words? I'm saying to you, it's not a conflict. You can be a Guyanese, that's your nationality, but you can be an Indian, but don't kill that Indian aspect of who you are. And that's my point.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor RAMHARACK. Yes, Dr. Mahadew, go ahead, please.
Yes. Maybe just to add on to what Dr. RAMHARACK is saying, I think first of all, what I showed in my analysis is maybe unconsciously, to an extent, we have accepted in most of the countries a kind of a second role or a follower's role. And I think the only way to improve that is we should increase our political participation. And we should develop parties that are based on values that brings welfare to all. Because especially in all the Caribbean countries, we need to make alliances with others. And we have to become ready. And I think we should participate also much more in institutions, in boards of institutions, so that we bring our thinking in those boards and get a better society for all of us. So it's not mainly, as KIRK is saying, it should be never based to serve an ethnic group. But the values that we are thinking, I think at least, brings welfare to everyone. Whether you are from African descent or Chinese, it doesn't matter because it's for everyone.
Here. Thank you.
Dr. Mahadew, let me just pose this question to you, and this is from the chat. Charlene says, I do not believe that we should speak about corruption of Indo presidents or prime ministers in the Caribbean without examining the wider country context and the level of corruption that exists. So can Dr. Mahadew speak to the levels of corruption in the society and levels of corruption in governance overall?
Well, in this case, I analyze at least the situation as going on now. I think I can produce a list easy of 50 things, 50 corruption cases where the government has handled poorly or badly, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know. But I can see also legal documents that are constructed in such a way that I cannot qualify them as good governance. And I think the person can read everyday newspapers and will see everyday new cases.
Thank you very much. Dr. Indira Ramprasad, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Shalima. Yes, I want to just touch on the subject of the reluctance of Indians to assert their Indianness. I'm talking about Indians in government or Indian leaders. And mention was made of Jagan being of that ilk. Basdev Pandey was also accused of the politics of appeasement for bending backwards to appease the non-Indo population and neglecting to some extent the Indian population. And there is a reason for this, a very rational reason for this, political reason for this. The Indians have a lot of difficulty getting into power. And in Trinidad and Tobago, I would say it's due to the way the boundaries have been traditionally been drawn. Also, the mixed population tend to gravitate more towards the Afro party than the Indo-based party. And courting that group is a challenge and always been a challenge for the Indo-based parties. And therefore, the challenge becomes more potent when they get into government and they have to govern these multi-ethnic groups in the society. They want to keep all these groups satisfied, and this is what Kurt was talking about, trying to share the pie more equally for everyone to benefit, and not seeming as if they're bending backwards to any particular group, including their own ethnic group, because the challenge of governing a multi-ethnic society, a plural society like Trinidad and Guyana is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. I remember when the UNC came into power, we had a symposium and Center of Excellence. Under Kamala Prasad, sorry. So it was People's Partnership. And they were talking about multiculturalism and this whole debate. And there was so much fear. Multiculturalism, I mean, one dimension of it is embracing all these ethnic groups and equalizing to some extent or a more equitable share of the national pie. But there was so much fear. And we saw groups coming forward that we've never heard before. And that would have included the First Peoples at that time, who are now much more vocal. We also had the Baptists benefiting under Basdev Pandey. So it's much more of a challenge for an Indo leader, I would say, to govern a multi-ethnic society. It's much more of a challenge because they want to equalize the national pie, because it's not there before. It's not there. It's not there when the other party has been in power, the more established party, and also to appease to those other groups, some of whom would have supported them to win the election because they need that other group. And I'm talking about the mixed group or the third force. It may not be mixed people necessarily, but the third force that doesn't necessarily vote one or two of the main ethnic parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Indira. Kirk, would you like to respond?
I largely agree with what Indira was saying. Hi, Indira. We are old colleagues. We used to be neighbors even. So,
yes, we live across from each other. Yeah.
But I didn't get the last point you made though. Sorry, I was a message had been coming in. Did you have a question?
Point, me? No, what I would say is that it's a more of a challenge to govern multi-ethnic society for Indian leaders, I have been part of that process, so I know I have been part of it, both as an academic, as an activist, and an advocate. I've been part of the process.
I don't really have anything to add except perhaps that just like what the PNC are doing in Guyana right now, and what they did when the PPP were in power before, is that they create these false racist narratives. And very sadly, people sometimes accept them as though they are true without even knowing the facts. You know, so in Guyana, they're talking about apartheid. Can you imagine anything so ridiculous? But they are saying that apartheid is happening in Guyana. That is ridiculous. But and the PNM similarly do something. So they'll say when Kamala was in government, she's only supporting her people. That's absolutely ridiculous. And it's based on no facts whatsoever. And so we really have to. But that's part of the politics. That's part of the politics, and so we really do, you know. And as PRO of the party, it's really my job to separate these lies from facts. So.
Good, thank you. So political expediency makes it all worthwhile. So we have a question again in the chat, and this is from Virendra Singh. This is addressed to Dr. Mahadew. He says, you showed Indians leaving their countries for USA, Canada, UK, etc. What are the main reasons for this exodus? It cannot be just the trappings of the West. Do all these countries have a common reason?
Yeah, I think in both countries, in Guyana, I don't know the exact years, but at the time of Balram, things were very bad in Guyana economically. And so people were moving to Suriname from Guyana, and from Suriname, they found their way to somewhere in Europe and other places. And in Suriname, back after the independence, people moved to Netherlands. But in 1980, we got the military coup, the dictatorship, the military regime. And then a lot of people moved to Holland. So there's both to do with economic situation.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Narayan from Fiji, can you share with us, please, during the reign of Mahendrapal Chowdhury, what was the situation with migration out of Fiji?
As far as the Indian population is concerned, the migration was to a higher extent, and this was because of the political chaos that was prevalent in Fiji at that time. And as you all know, and it was mentioned over here by one of the presenters about the military coups that erupted. So to answer your question, basically, ma'am, there was a huge number of migration from Fiji to the other countries, mostly Australia and New Zealand, and this was due to their livelihoods. They basically wanted to improve their livelihoods in overseas, because in Fiji they were not able to get all those opportunities, right? Even though they had these qualifications of moving up in the fields of scholarships and getting good jobs in good positions. They were limited to get into these positions. So to get a better life, they moved to other countries. And that is the reason why the migration was at a high in those times, even when Mr. Chowdhury was in the parliament as a prime minister.
Excellent, thank you. So presenters, you all have done an excellent job. Thank you very much. I would now open the floor to you. If any one of you would like to make any closing comments, please do so now. Professor Ramharak.
Just a quick comment about Guyana that Professor Rampersad raised. You know, the problem in Guyana, and I know it is a situation in Fiji, it's dire there. You know, Brijlal, who has been writing a lot, who just passed away, was very much involved. So we had seen Fiji as a country where you could have actually come up with some kind of solution. But to come back to Guyana, the situation has reached to a point where there's a sort of a brink. And again, it goes back to the tradition where we were. We're now at the same situation, you know, where the country is divided. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to, even though we have been unwilling to address the problem, we have to find a way to confront the problem, frontally, because if the current leaders in Guyana, and again, this is the activist side of me speaking here, if we refuse to confront, if you have an opposition that is now saying there's apartheid that exists, and this is not just ordinary people who are crazy. These are people who are educated, who are well-established, well-known people in the African community are making those statements, and they have a lot of media outlet that they're doing it. So my point is simply that you have to confront it, whether Indians were unwilling to do it in the past or not. It has to be confronted, because at the same time, if you don't address the issues that they're raising and debunk them, then it means that you're now also setting up a situation where you will continue to have the kind of divided society and the violence which we have seen at every election, the most recent one being in Monrepo, right, where innocent Indians were beaten up. So you can't always have a situation where that's going to continue to happen, right? And you continue to have migration. So my point is, it has to be confronted frontally, right, with leaders from all sides. And we have made some proposals. We've talked about things like I don't have time to go into it, ethnic impact statement, decentralization, and so on, affirmative action. But if it's not, it's going to fester. So Indians have to, whether this party see themselves as an Indian government or not, I don't think they see themselves that way. Obviously, it's a government that represents all Guyanese. But the point is, the majority of the supporters who support them, they've got that one, seat majority. They have to find a way to confront the problem, and it has to be confronted by challenging others to come to that table and come up with practical solutions to address it. You can't always say, well, we're a multi-ethnic party, right? And then ignore the problem completely. On the one hand, that side is getting more radicalized, and then your supporters are always getting beat up, right? Always feeling the brunt. So it has to be addressed. And I think probably, as the professor said, maybe one of the ways to do that is if you have that third force, right? Or the fourth force, what you call it, which can have that, be that power broker in parliament that can, support policies when they kind of promote that movement towards bringing people together. So I think that would be one of the things we need to look at, but it has to be confronted, right? You just can't ignore, otherwise we'll end up, like a place like Fiji, where people will continuously leave. There were over 50% of the population at one point. We talk about Mahendra Chaudhry, who was, a friend of mine who was in parliament when that happened, he was taken hostage like other people. So we don't want that situation to continue to fester. It has to be confronted, has to be addressed. And that's my point to that. I know I'm just repeating what I said.
Yeah, but it drives the point home. We appreciate that. Thank you so much. Kirk, would you like to make your closing comments?
Yes, I think it's very important for us to compare our experiences. And I'd like to say that before I joined, and one point is that confronting the misinformation, I think BAYTORAM was talking about that, is very, very important. And many of these Indian-based parties have not done so forcefully enough and have allowed hostile narratives to become the dominant narrative. And certainly that is one thing that I as part of the PRO of the UNC, we are concentrating on that because that is very, very important, because the misinformation spread, not only nationally, but internationally, is very, very destructive. It is very, very toxic, and we must confront it frontally. I have to say, before I joined, just a final thing, before I joined the UNC as a political, and I was a political analyst, independent senator and so forth, I served on race relations committees appointed by the president at that time, George Maxwell Richards. And in fact, during the Guyanese crisis, when the PNC refused to abide by the election results, I was down in Guyana, part of a process to help push that forward. And one of the suggestions I had made there, which I still think is valid and important, is that, as I have been involved in a, race relations committee here, and that's one of many, and I'm sure in Guyana there's been many, and they're great. The recommendations are, amazing. The people involved are well-meaning, amazing, but it always just gathers dust on the shelf and so forth, and nothing gets implemented. But I really do think that a joint Trinidad, Guyana relations committee by both countries looking at each other, because then you have some of the objectivity of being outside and you're not so much connected to the inside groups. And I think that might be something very important, that we can look at ethnic relations, not just only between Afros and Indians, but ethnic relations in general in our societies. And because it is a regional problem, and perhaps that might be something to break the kind of lethargy in the whole system. But we need to keep confronting it until we have justice and just representation and equality in representation in our countries.
A very good suggestion, and I hope it did come to fruition. Thank you very much. Dr. Mahadew, your closing comments, please.
Maybe just a closing remark. I think we have identified that our countries look quite a lot like each other. We have common challenges. And I think that we should, as KIRK suggested already, think much more in how can we have cross-country organizations or teams that can look to certain problems, because we can really learn a lot from each other. We have a lot of our people in diaspora places where they have other experiences. So I think let's join our forces and come to do things that is good for our countries and communities.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Mr. Narayan, you're furthest from all of us, but what would you like to say?
Firstly, I would like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity. Now, it is the first time for me to be on such a platform, and I really appreciate the invitation and being given this opportunity. Now, the second thing is that the presenters that presented today, I have grasped a lot of things from your presentations, and I have noted a lot of things down because I believe that once we are going on to a path, we need to be strong. Once we are getting weak, we will definitely falter. We may not be able to achieve what we are going through. So looking at the presentations and the thoughts that came up from all the great academians and individuals, it gave me that that enrichment, which I think I should have had from the beginning. But now, since I have got this far, it is going to take me a lot further. The last comment that I wish to give over here is, this is in response to one of the comments made by, I think it was Dr. DEWANAND MAHADEW. I would like to apologize before I make this comment if this comment hurts him in any way. Now, when he was delivering his comment, he's mentioned to be away from the words Girmityas. Whether or not to refer to it. But in my opinion, I believe that is our identity. We stood up from that identity being termed as a Girmitya. And then we stood up, all of the Indians who moved as Girmityas or rather indentures. They moved to the places of the world and made their name all around. So that is a strength on itself from where we stood up, our generation stood up, and now like we are on this platform, moving around the world. So I believe that we should not refrain from this, right? We should not be shy of being called a Girmitya or its descendants. So that is what I had thought of. And it's not good to leave the roots. We need to hold on to the roots so that we will be able to grasp what is in future for us. thank you for that, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be a presenter on this platform. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Narayan, and thank you for pointing out that distinction between what I think may have been an error on the part of Dr. Bhagwan in understanding the difference between the term Girmityas and the term Hindustani. Hindustani is significant for Surinamese in particular. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring today's program to a close. Thank you very much to all of our presenters and our participants. And at this point in time, I will say, let me bring in back our chair, Shakira, who will formally close the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shalima, for being a wonderful moderator. And thank you all for taking the time to participate, especially to the presenters. Thank you very much. As I have said before, the public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. Feel free to contact ICC to publish your books and your reports. Remember that we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions as well as a donation. Please contact Dr. Mahaber for details. Thank you also to the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahaber. Thank you also to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravin Ramsingh, who has been recording the program and will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. Our topic next Sunday will be the role of Indo-Trinidadians in achieving independence for Trinidad and Tobago in 1962. Please like, share, and follow our Facebook page. I am Shakira Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyabad.
Thank you all very much for. If anybody has any burning question or comment to make, we can do that before we close.